Välkomna till Samtal med samhället här på Riks. Vad är postmodernism och var kommer postmodernismen ifrån? Är det den berömda kunskapsrelativismen som är problemet med postmodernismen eller snarare dess tendens att förkasta den värld vi lever i på basis av krav på en omöjlig jämlikhet? Om detta fick jag prata nyligen här på Riks med Stephen Hicks, en världsauktoritet på området och författare till Explaining Postmodernism.
Stephen Hicks är en kanadensisk filosof verksam vid Rockford University i Illinois. Hans mest kända verk är Explaining Postmodernism, på svenska postmodernismens förklaring, skepticism och socialism från Rousseau till Foucault. Stephen Hicks menar att postmodernismen är en nutida variant av förnuftskritik som funnits sedan 1700-talet och att rörelsen fick extra fart efter att socialismen visat sig inte fungera. I sitt samtal med Riks ger Stephen Hicks en djupare förklaring av vad postmodernismen är när den kritiserar förnuftet och blir ett verktyg för en vänsterideologi som lever på avund och utopisk idealism.
Stephen Hicks, welcome to Sweden and welcome to Riks.
All right, thanks for having me.
I just read your book, Postmodernism Explained, in English, and it exists in Swedish as well. Postmodernismens förklaring. Let's start by hearing how you define or describe in a few words postmodernism today.
I think the best way is to take the big word postmodern, break it down to its two components.
Yeah.
So the stem is modern, and post is to say we need to go beyond the modern or to reject the modern in some way. So modernism is a set of ideas and institutions that are characteristic of the modern world, which has been extraordinarily revolutionary. Now, I'm a philosopher by training, but there's a confluence between how philosophers use modernism and historians will use modernism, essentially the last 500 years. So 500 years ago, Columbus is crossing the ocean, and that's huge. In the art world, it's the generation of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. So the art world is being transformed.
The Renaissance, perhaps.
The Renaissance, yeah. The Renaissance is in full swing in northern Italy and other parts of Europe as well. And the Renaissance is not only arts, it's also someone like Copernicus publishing his sun-centered model of the universe, also in the early 1500s. In religious history, it's the time of Martin Luther in the early part. So that then is to say, in terms of world exploration in the arts, in the sciences, in religion, everything is being transformed. Now, in the philosophical world, when we say we're going to do modern philosophy, we usually start with Francis Bacon, and René Descartes, a little bit later, late 1500s, early 1600s. And what is happening there is an intellectual revolution. That is to say, human beings are first and foremost creatures of reason. And so there's a huge philosophical challenge to much of the traditional philosophy that had been based on some sort of authority. It might be the authority of God speaking directly to you, or God speaking through scripture that has infallible authority, or there might be an institution like a church that has authority. But the idea there is that in some sense, you as an individual accept authority.
Yeah.
And the philosophical revolution is to say, no, you think for yourself. And Bacon and Descartes and a little bit later John Locke are vehement on that. And it's an international movement. So in France, someone like Montaigne is arguing the same sort of thing. In Italy, a big part of Galileo's battles with the established church were over authority. Do we accept the authority of the church, the authority of Scripture, or do I accept the authority of my own eyes, the mathematics, and using scientific method? So there's a philosophical revolution, scientific, religious, artistic, globalization revolution, and that's the modern world. Now, to the extent that those revolutions were successful, modern science comes into existence, religion in the modern world comes into existence. And the way we're doing religion, if we just focus on that for a moment, is the idea that people need to be concerned and self-responsible for the salvation of their own souls, for example. And then, at least in the Protestant line of argument, it was therefore they need to be able to understand God's word and to interpret it for themselves. And that means translation of the Bible into the various language. So it's a democratization of religious texts, and in a democratization and individualization of the skills. So suddenly the emphasis is in having individuals able to read, interpret, think, and argue for themselves. And that's a huge cognitive revolution. Yeah. The same thing is happening in the early sciences. We need to look at the human body and do the dissections, look at nature and come up with taxonomical schemes in biology, use the new microscopes to look at smaller and smaller things, and then the telescopes to look at the heavens. But we are developing better observation skills, better observation technologies. The mathematics is being developed. It's also then important now if we jump into the 1600s, very sophisticated statistical methods are being developed. Leibniz. You have
not yet used the word reason.
That's right. Okay, good. We will get there.
But you're talking about it all the time.
I'm talking about it, yes, exactly. We're developing the calculus, right, and sophisticated mathematics, and so on. So, yes, to put all of that together, the argument is, this is the philosophical argument, that philosophically human beings are creatures of reason, first and foremost, and reason in religion, reason in the sciences, even reason in the arts.
And of their own reason.
That's right. And the idea is that it's not the reason of some elites, right? That rather this is a universal birthright. Every human being has a working brain, a working mind, and therefore has a cognitive and a moral responsibility to learn how to use that and to become a self-governing individual on the basis of that. Now, this is then...
All that sounds great.
Yes.
But what is it within postmodernism that goes beyond that?
Okay. It's postmodernism then, 3 centuries later, 4 centuries later, comes on the heels of another philosophical revolution, where what has happened is that philosophy has entered into a very skeptical phase. So the modernism and the Enlightenment, the developments of science and reason and so forth, enormous successes in creating what we now think of as the modern world. But then philosophy starts to become increasingly skeptical. Maybe our senses don't put us in contact with an external world. Maybe definitions and words are just arbitrary symbols that we make up. Maybe mathematics is just a game. Maybe logic is just a subjective set of categories and principles that we can dispense with or decide to use as a matter of will. So human cognition is extraordinarily complicated, but what the philosophers had done, this is now over the 1800s and on into the 1900s, was exploded all of the major theories of cognition that were optimistic about the power of human reason. And so by the time we get to, I'm going to say the formative decade is the 1950s, and this is the first generation of postmodernism, is that philosophy in all of in the Americas, in the British speaking world, and on the continent was at a skeptical phase. We don't really know anything. Our senses are illusory, mathematics and science are arbitrary, et cetera, et cetera. The first generation postmodernists, Michel Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, Richard Rorty, all of the famous guys, are getting PhDs in philosophy at this time. And they're very smart, and they are becoming convinced that truth is an empty concept. Objectivity is a myth. And so what we need to do is rethink the human condition, getting past the idea that human beings are reasonable, rationality, that truth and objectivity matter. So if the fundamental thing about the modern world is universal reason, And now we have a generation of very sophisticated philosophers saying reason is not a truth-seeking vehicle. It is not objective, and therefore it is subjective and not at all universal. It becomes relativized. That becomes the new wave philosophically, working that out for what that means for religion, what that means for science, what that means for the law, what that means for how we educate children, what that means for the arts. That is the work of the postmoderns in the latter part of the 20th century and now into our generation.
But is it possible to imagine that the belief in reason and this optimism in wanting to know more could have continued? Because, I mean, you talk, for example, about the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He's one of the representatives of the counter-enlightenment. And if I understand him right, he says that in some way we never have direct access to reality. Isn't that a motivated question? Do we really have it?
Well, in the first part of your question, I do think that the Enlightenment and modernism have continued. We still have a magnificent Enlightenment culture. The achievements that are going on in science, technologies, engineering, advances in medicine, and I think also we're making great moral progress in many dimensions. What has happened is postmodernism started as a minority movement within academic, but it has become a significant, possibly a majority intellectual movement in the academics. That's not to say that there are not advocates of modernism and even pre-modernism still there. It's just that the intellectual center of gravity has shifted, and postmodernism has also spilled out into intellectual culture, political culture, popular culture as well. So we have much more of a battleground intellectually and philosophically right than before. Now, you mentioned Kant. Yeah, Kant died in 1804. And this is a controversial claim because Kant is a mixed character. In some ways, he is an Enlightenment figure. He does believe that human beings have a certain amount of moral dignity that comes from being willing to reason and to seek for moral principles. So the argument that Kant is of the counter-Enlightenment turns on some pretty fundamental arguments. That what he wants to argue is that if we say, for example, that perception or the use of our senses is our most immediate source of contact with reality. And in some sense, we need to build up our conceptual theories and so forth on the basis of, say, empirical evidence. If you then say that perceptual evidence is not putting you in direct contact with reality, in some sense it's distant from reality, then that marks a philosophical turning point. And the claim is going to be that Kant does mark such a philosophical turning point, and then subsequent generations of philosophers are working out the implications of that. What does that then mean for our concepts? What does it mean for language? What does it mean for theories? What does it mean for the experimental method? But these things are complicated. They work out slowly, so it's not until the middle part of the 20th century that the full skeptical implications get worked out, and that's when postmodernism becomes a force.
Yeah, but I ask that question because sometimes I can sense, at least in Sweden, a certain people are too naive when they criticize postmodernism as if knowledge was easy. As if we could just have continued to believe in knowledge. I mean, it is a fact that there is a sociology of knowledge. It's having right at university is not perhaps not going to give you right, if you understand what I mean.
No, sure.
You have there are some certain aspects of knowledge that that makes it more complicated than just saying, here I am, I have my reason, I have my senses, and I can know the world.
Right. No, absolutely. The human cognition is extraordinarily complex. I mean, our brain is complex. And I think we are still in the early days of working out the neuroscience and working out the psychology in any sort of a sophisticated fashion. But you're right that there is a certain naivety about the easiness of knowledge, and in some forms of knowledge are relatively easy, using your senses. But very quickly, conceptualization becomes complicated? How do we define terms correctly? What counts as a sophisticated use of language? How do I put together a multi-step argument? If the matter is complicated and we have a huge amount of facts and we are working on some new territory, how do we look at, say, the same set of facts from a number of different perspectives and play them off against each other to sort out which perspective is better and perhaps to integrate? And so working out all of the tools of logic and mathematics becoming increasingly sophisticated. There's a great deal of work for philosophers to do working with neuroscientists, working with psychologists. And in that sense, it's very easy for skeptics to say, well, there are naive theories in all of these areas, to poke holes and to
say that there is no knowledge.
That's right. That's right. So that doesn't work, and then we move on. So in one sense, destruction is always easier than creation. Perhaps this is not the best analogy, but if you think of a stained glass window in some magnificent cathedral, all of the engineering and artistry that would go into creating that great stained glass window, it's immensely complex and a great labor of love, but it's very easy to take a stone and throw it through the window and destroy the whole thing. So what has happened, though, is that on one hand, we have become more sophisticated in our science, in our scientific method, in our applied uses of reason, but we have become weak philosophically at articulating good theories of all of that. And that weakness has left some openings for the postmoderns to come in and then to undercut, well, you don't really see the world, right? Or you're just making up words, or statistics can be manipulated to do whatever you want, or people have various sorts of biases, and biases can dictate. And so there's a whole battery of skeptical arguments that even the average educated person is not able instantly to answer in a sophisticated fashion, so they're just left defenseless and, well, maybe.
So if I
we don't
understand
have
you
knowledge.
right, what you're saying is that we have to recognize that knowledge is difficult, it's sophisticated and difficult, but that doesn't mean that there is no knowledge. And philosophy today should provide us with the tools to respond to skepticals who say there is no knowledge.
Right, yes. So in the division of labor, with respect to coming up with a full theory of what the human condition is, yes, the philosophers do have an important role at the level of foundations. And the claim with respect to the postmoderns is that by the middle part of the 20th century and on into the late 20th century, when postmodernism was able to develop itself and grow, philosophy was in a somewhat defenseless, skeptical phase. There had been a number
deconstructing knowledge.
That's right. That's and that's the right word to use. It had deconstructed itself in all of the major areas, and it takes a while for some intellectual of great stature to come along and come up with a new, sophisticated theory that can integrate the neuroscience and integrate the psychology and integrate the philosophical knowledge to put together a full theory of knowledge, and we're still working on that.
Yeah. If we go back to your book, let's say that the aim of your book is to give a historical explanation of postmodernism, and you present two main theses, and perhaps we have already discussed the first one, that the Enlightenment failed to defend its view on reason, and that it let the philosophers of the counter-Enlightenment influence Western thought. So I think we can move to the second one, perhaps, which is that the collapse of socialism much later and communism, with that, postmodernism became necessary.
Okay.
What do you mean?
All right. Well, that's thanks for putting that out there for me.
Yeah.
So, in one sense, the collapse of kind of optimistic understandings of human cognition is not going to predict anything. If you don't think knowledge is possible, well, what do you do next? Well, you can just say, well, you just give up and just believe whatever you want to believe, and be skeptical or subjectivist in whatever direction you want. So the interesting thing, though, about postmodernism is that it's not the case that the postmodern leading thinkers were just all over the map. politically, religiously, or ideologically. The interesting thing is that in the first generation, all of the leading postmodern thinkers were on the left.
In the 1960s, perhaps.
Yes, and not only on the left, which is a pretty big tent, but on the far left, and even the farthest part of the far left. So to put some names to it, the most famous postmodern thinker is perhaps Michel Foucault. In the American context, Richard Rorty. Jean-Francois Lyotard gave us the name, the postmodern condition. You mentioned deconstruction. Jacques Derrida is the name most associated with that. Now, all of these guys are interesting in two ways. They're all PhDs in philosophy. And they're all PhDs in philosophy about cognition issues. And so when they are very smart young guys in the 1950s getting their PhDs at good universities, they're absorbing the deep skepticism that was prevalent there. But at the same time, they were politically engaged, and all of them committed to fairly far-left politics. So Foucault, for example, joined for a short while the French Communist Party. So this is, and that's a fairly serious commitment to make. Richard Rorty was raised by followers of Trotsky. And he speaks about this in his biography. Lyotard also is a leftist of a more Trotskyite version of Marxism as well. And Derrida is perhaps the most apolitical of them. But at various points, he does say toward the end of his life that all of his deconstruction of language and post-structuralism is motivated by a kind of Marxism. It's in the spirit of Marxism. And I don't think this is then accidental, because then if you suppose you say, look, nobody knows anything. It's all skeptical, it's all subjective, right? Just do whatever you want, then you would expect people...
Or knowledge is something you use to use power over others.
That's right, yeah. So, what kind of power do you want to be? Well, maybe I want to be a monarchist, or maybe I want to be a fascist, right? Or maybe I want to be a liberal Democrat, or whatever. If your political power aspirations are just purely subjective, we should expect then people to be all over the place politically. So the fact, though, that these postmodern strategies, these cognitive skeptical strategies, all this talk about being skeptical about narratives and meta-narratives and so on, are being used by a segment of the very far left, that is interesting to me. So the second thesis you mentioned was to say, where was socialism in the 1950s? And on the 1960s. Now, standard histories of the politics will say there was a huge break in the left movement, a break from the old left to the new left. And most histories of the 1960s will say this is when the new left comes into existence. And partly the new left is a splintering of what had been a pretty unified left movement up until the 1960s. And so suddenly we've got all of these, I think of them as adjective leftisms. So I'm a socialist, but then we have some adjective, and there's 40 or 50 different adjectives defining your particular version of socialism. And that is part of the movement toward postmodernism, which is to say we're getting away from universalism, from the idea that there's one objective right way of looking at the world. Everything is splintered and fractured, and we need to just go off in different directions, right, and so on. But what had happened to socialism in the 1950s? And a couple of things had happened that were decisive for the evolution of socialism in the 1950s. One was that if you were a socialist in the early part of the 20th century, you almost exclusively were a Marxist socialist. So there are lots of versions of socialism in the 1800s, early 1900s, but after 1917, success of the Russian Revolution, all of the left says, wow, it's the Marxist version, and they sign on to some sort of Marxist version. Marxist Leninism, Marxist Stalinism, right, and so on. But it's going to be Marxism, and the Soviet Union is showing the world the way to the future. It is going to be economically superior to decadent capitalism, to decadent liberalism in the West. It's also going to be morally superior to individualism and capitalist exploitation, right, and so forth. So if you then look at the history of the left, it's shocking now how many people were not only just interested in and excited about some sort of Marxist socialism, but totally signing on to the Marxist vision of the world. And it's not just an intellectual understanding, that it becomes part of your soul, part of your identity, what it is to be a decent, progressive, humanistic person. Right?
But the error of Karl Marx, that was to predict the future, wasn't it?
Well, but then this is part of the sort of Enlightenment vision. Marx had said, Marx and Engels, that their socialism was scientific socialism, right? That we are looking at the world the way it works, we are doing logical analyses, we are sorting all of the variables, and on the basis of that, just like good social scientists, we can make predictions about the way the world works. Now, we could have arguments about the strength of their commitment to science, but nonetheless, that is a big part of what the Marxists are saying. We are materialists, we are scientists, we are logical. It's the iron hand of historical necessity that is going to bring socialism about. And these are the predictions about what's going to happen in capitalism. These are the predictions about what's going to happen when socialism is tried. Now, if you go from 1848, when Communist Manifesto was published, to 1948, that's 100 years of trying to do social science Marxism. By the time you get to 1948, we're coming out of World War II, things are getting back to normal, including intellectual life, and smart people are looking at the data, and it's not going well for socialism. Right? So socialist economies are struggling on basic things. And even if you hate capitalism, you think it's exploitative, when you look at the capitalist nations around the world, the United States, people are getting richer. There are fewer poorer people. There's a huge growing middle class. There's larger and larger numbers of millionaires going along. And all of this is the opposite of what Marx had predicted. Rather than capitalism immiserating and making everybody poor, and rather than socialism enriching everyone, the social science data is predicting the exact opposite.
But why would the failure of socialism make postmodernism necessary?
Yes, good. But then the second part of this is not just...
You can imagine that people just, okay, it didn't work. Let's do something else.
That's right. So then the second part of it has to be the humanitarian vision as well. Socialism is a moral ideal. Capitalism, we think, is morally suspect in various ways. But by the time we get to 1956, there's the Hungarian Revolution that was squashed. Worldwide television. You can see what the socialists are doing. They don't care about the workers. They don't care about students. They will squash you, sending in the tanks. You have Khrushchev saying that, in fact, Stalin and Lenin before him, but especially Stalin, terrible crimes against humanity. Recognizing that the socialism as practiced in the Soviet Union was a monster. This is terrible for anybody who's a young, idealistic, smart socialist in the 1950s. Now we come to your question. How do you react to that? Now, if you are then a thoughtful person, and you come to think knowledge, though, is subjective, and socialism has been a great failure, both in terms of its moral ideals and its economic aspirations. What do you do? That's a moment of crisis for you. Now, why I say it makes it necessary is I like to think in terms of a religious analogy here. So if you think of someone who is a young person and becomes religious, they think deeply about the way the world, and they come to convince themselves there must be a God who created the world, created the natural laws, gave us a moral order, and what it means then to be a rational and a decent human being is to commit to a certain religious worldview. But then suppose you go through the kind of crisis that many religious people will go through. You study the arguments and you come to think, wow, I don't think the arguments for the existence of God are very good. And maybe all of these atheistic and materialistic arguments that are based on evolution, right, and so forth, give a better explanation. That's going to be an intellectual crisis of faith for your belief in religion. If at the same time your moral faith in your religion has come to that believing in God and certain commandments is what it is to be a decent human being. But I can't believe that anymore. And maybe I see many of my favored religious leaders acting in immoral ways and all kinds of even religious oppression. How do I respond to that crisis? It's both an intellectual and a moral crisis for you. And we know that people will react in one of two different ways at that point. Some people will say, look, the most important thing is I have to be a rational being. That's my bottom line as a human being. And if I am not intellectually convinced that religion can provide rational and moral answers to the world, then I have to become non-religious. I'll become an agnostic, maybe I will become an atheist, but I need to follow the reason because reason is fundamental. But we know that some people also at that same juncture point will go in a different direction. What they will say is, look, I know the arguments are not very good, and I know the historical track record is not very good, but I want to believe my religion subjectively. That's what my identity is. And so what I'm going to do is find a way to make a subjective commitment, a faith commitment to my religion. And that's going to mean, though, that I have to find some way to set aside reason, to set aside evidence, to set aside the idea that logic and rationality matter fundamentally. So when we look at religious history, we find this divide going on. There are those that are committed to reason, fundamentally, and they will say religion is compatible with that, and those who will go on the offensive against reason in order to maintain their religious faith.
Yeah. In Sweden, we say today, a lot of people say often that our political correctness, which is the sort of Swedish ideology, is our new religion.
That's right. Okay,
because it permits people to be good. To believe in something good, even if it's irrational.
That's right. That's right. And so that then is to say, for them, subjectively, their moral commitments and or their political commitments are fundamental to them. They are not going to give those up no matter what the logic, what the evidence, what the historical data say. But if they are smart people, they know there are lots of people who say, no, logic, history, and evidence matter. So they need to have some cognitive strategy to get rid of that, to be able to say evidence does not matter, logic does not matter, and so forth. And that's the postmodern move right there. So if for you, political correctness, wokeness, some sort of ideology, and it's most prevalent on the left, not exclusively on the left, if your commitment to that is the deepest thing for you, but you recognize that you have lots of intellectual adversaries who believe in logic and science and the Enlightenment and so forth, what you need is tools that will enable you to set that aside. So this is where then we find people will saying, look, logic, that's just a white male thing.
Yeah. But at the same time, the modern left is very, very intellectual, because they have so many theories. Foucault, as you said, and theories on power. But you see those tools as being fake tools in order to maintain a certain belief in. Yes, that's right.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, the modern left, though, is a very big tent, and it's not only postmodern. There still are many people on the left who are Enlightenment science types of people, and they will still say that postmodern leftism is an embarrassment because it is irrational and it is anti-rational, and so that we need to clean house intellectually as well. But they are becoming less dominant in the left than the postmoderns are. And of course, part of being an intellectual, there's an old history of this, and it's not only in religious history, and it's not only in political history, it's also in other areas as well. There are always people who can be very smart, but their being rational is a matter of after the fact rationalizing what they have made a subjective commitment to. So, and this is where it's very hard to make generalizations, that when you are talking to any given person, you have to get to know that person as an individual, and typically for a long time, to know whether that person really is open to the evidence, open to logic or not. And part of the postmodern strategy, though, is to develop very sophisticated rhetorical strategies that when their arguments get in trouble, to derail that argument in some way. So it might be, well, it's just, that's a perceptual claim and perceptions are illusions, right? Or that's a definitional claim and definitions are arbitrary. Or that's a semantic issue and semantics is subjective. Or that's a statistical claim and statistics are always manipulated. And what those all have in common is they are making cognitive claims to try to diffuse a broadly rational argument. Someone is making an appeal to evidence, to logic, to statistics or whatever that they don't want to have to acknowledge. And so they want to just derail that, and then it just looks like, oh, well, if I can set that claim aside, then whatever other subjective claim I want to make is still a contender. It's still on the table. And you do find, of course, when you engage with the people in religious circles as well, religious people also can be incredibly intellectual.
Oh, yeah.
That's right, and there are many schools, and some of them are genuinely committed to reason. Some of them are seemingly committed to reason, but if you push them too far, they will find a way to derail the argument because ultimately they have a faith commitment to what it is that they're going to believe. And then some people in religion are explicitly anti-rational. They won't play the reason game from the beginning. The exact same thing is happening on the postmodern left. So why I say in the book that postmodernism became necessary, it became necessary for those who are previously committed ideologically to some sort of leftism. It is their core identity. It's their understanding of what it is to be a good person and their hope for the world. And that needs to be protected no matter what. And one of the things that then needs to be protected against is the arguments by the free market economists, the track records of the liberal democracy, the historical record in socialist nations around the world. And so you have sophisticated intellectual strategies that are performing a self-protective mechanism to something that is an ideological subjective commitment in the first place.
Yeah. One of the aspects that you're talking about in your book is that the left thought goes from needs to equality.
Yes.
Can you explain?
Well, if you want to make the claim that one of your objective criteria for measuring the effectiveness and decency of a social system is how well it provides for people's basic needs. Does it put food on the table, clothes on people's back, roofs over their heads, provide the material goods, aspirations for economic market? That is to say, human beings have certain needs, and we can define what those needs are objectively, and they are universal. Then we will use the historical track records of different kinds of systems and measure them against how well they satisfy those needs or not. Now, that then is to say, in the first century of modern socialism, so then there's various versions, but they all wanted to say, socialism will do a better job at fulfilling basic human needs. Capitalism will not. It is going to immiserate the large, or drive into poverty the large numbers of people. Socialism will bring about universal prosperity. By the time, though, we get to the 1950s, people who are looking at the data seriously are recognizing that capitalism is fulfilling people's needs much, much better than socialism is. So what do you do about that? One strategy then is to say, well, if we have to argue, yes, capitalism is providing with people's basic needs, fine, then we can't use that as a criticism of capitalism anymore. We need a different kind of criticism. And so what you find quite explicitly in the late 1950s is the strategists among the far left saying it's not the fulfillment of human needs, it's the equal distribution of resources. So capitalism is generating much more prosperity. They have to recognize that. The problem is, from their perspective, that who's getting a larger share of all of that prosperity is richer people.
Who is exploiting who?
That's right. So these people are going up here, the poorest people, but these people are going up faster. And so the shift then is equality. And again, equality is put forth as another objective criterion, because you can measure it. And you can compare social systems in terms of that objective measure. But the important thing is that that's a major strategic shift. We're not saying capitalism is bad because it doesn't provide for needs. We are providing equality as the standard, and that has been the mantra for some portions of the left since 1960 or so.
The problem is that there will always be inequality in the world. So there will always be something to change, you know.
Yes.
Something that has to be taken care of.
Yes, but then that has also been among people who are still advocates of doing social science, right? A debate, well, how do we properly formulate the concept of equality? Because that's already a pretty big tent economy. Which ones are morally significant? Which kinds of inequality are to be celebrated? And which kinds are to be condemned? But all of that is still going on by people who are on the left and people who are on the right on objective grounds. Right? So what the postmoderns want to do is say it's not only on economic grounds, but it's going to be on other grounds that we're going to be egalitarian in various ways.
There is a middle way here. You can always say that there should be equality of opportunities, right? That is one way to say it.
Yeah, well, yes, sure. Opportunities of outcomes is one sort. Opportunities of equality is another. Equality of freedom, that human beings have the same liberty rights, so they can stand or fall on their own basis. So, yeah, already equality, just as the concept of liberty, and it's liberty and equality are the two big socially normative concepts of the modern world. They already require a great deal of philosophical unpacking, and then a great deal of moral debating as well.
Yeah.
So the point there only just is that equality for the left came to be important in the 1960s rather than need up to that point.
There is a very interesting chapter in the last part of your book where you show how self-contradictory postmodern thought is sometimes. Because at the same time, they tell us that all knowledge is relative, but their knowledge on relativity is not. And they tell us that Western culture is profoundly sexist or racist, but they are very well aware of the fact that we are often less sexist and racist than other cultures, or they expect us to be for some reason. Could you explain a little bit what this is all about?
Yeah, in part it's a contradiction in the aspirations of people on the left.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you want to say that having access to wealth and technologies and freedoms, those are good and those are important goods, and so you recognize that in fact originally Western societies made great strides in appealing to those, but at the same time you cannot give credit to the institutions that made that possible. Capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and so forth. So within the left, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, for example, just to focus on technology issues, they were always bad. Right? But then at the same time, you want the goodies to come out there, and how to put that together has always been a problem. But at the same time, the postmodern position, and this is where the contradictions become most explicit, is that what you do as a postmodern is argue that since reason is not efficacious on your view, that we are doing politics in a different way, rhetoric, and the effectiveness in the use of language matters more than truth, evidence, objectivity, and so on. So it becomes a matter of using arguments that will be effective to your particular context. And in different contexts, you will be quite comfortable with using different kinds of arguments. So, for example, if you have people you are arguing with, and they are making, say, very strong fact-based, logic-based, evidence-based arguments, then it's very useful for you to destabilize their arguments by playing epistemological games, by saying everything is just semantics, everything is just relative, everything is just opinion, right, and so forth. At the same time, those kind of people will also believe that their society is making great moral progress, that we are the heirs of the Enlightenment, we are building a beautiful, progressive world. And what has been very useful is to say, yes, but look at this problem, this inequality, and you know that people will be, since they take their moral criteria very seriously, they will be disturbed by that. And since they think of themselves as, say, progressive on sexism and progressive on racism, if you can find a way to accuse them or some system that they advocate of being sexist or racist, that will be very destabilizing for them. So you can then use either of those arguments, and whether they are consistent with each other doesn't really matter. So I think the best analogy is to think about a lawyer who goes into a courtroom and is making a case to a jury. Whether that lawyer, over the course of 1 or 2 weeks of making arguments and presenting evidence to the jury, all of the arguments are consistent with each other, to some lawyers that matters. Facts matter. Having a logically coherent case matters because the truth matters and we have to get justice. But for other lawyers, on day 1 of the trial, they will make a certain kind of argument that they think might be effective with the jury. On day 5, make an argument that, strictly speaking, is logically contradictory to the argument that was made on day 1. And that doesn't matter, because they think they scored their points on day 1, and now they're scoring some different points on day 5. And as long as they can say anything that will destabilize the other side's arguments, plant various sorts of seeds of doubt, or have a constellation of arguments that all point in a direction they want the jury to go, that's fine.
But do you see this as a conscious strategy? Or?
Yes, it is a conscious strategy. Now, sometimes, of course, people will make inconsistent arguments just because it's hard when you're dealing with things. Or you learn things, right? Or you think through the implications of something and you find you have a contradiction in your thinking. Now, your attitude toward that, though, tells a lot about you. If you find wait a second, last week I said this, now I'm saying that's a contradiction, and you're embarrassed by that, then that says something about your commitment to logic and rationality. If you then say, I'm going to exert the effort to rethink through and how to resolve this contradiction, and I will admit I have been contradicting myself, that's a kind of intellectual honesty. But what the postmoderns will say explicitly, and it is part of explicit strategy, you read this in Foucault, you read this in Derrida, you read this in Herbert Marcuse, is logical consistency does not matter. Rhetorical effectiveness is what matters. We live in a battleground, and who wins in the battle is what is paramount. And any rhetorical tool, whether it's consistent with other rhetorical tools, is the fundamental.
But don't you think that, for example, Foucault, when he says that he describes what he sees as a capitalist non-moral society, and that he would like to see something else?
Yes.
So maybe if you are believe in Foucault and you believe in equality, you should also believe in truth and honesty.
Well, you
or
can.
Am I too naive?
That's right. No, I think there are people who are liberal, who are libertarian, and people who are on the left, and they will read Foucault, and that what they will find in him is, and there is a consistent streak in Foucault where he is outraged by certain forms of oppression and exploitation, and you respond to that as a decent human being. And in many cases, he is pointing out historical facts and historical structures that are oppressive, right, and so forth. So the question, though, is going to be philosophically, if you are a Foucauldian, do you have the philosophical resources to say, my outrage against that oppression is grounded on an objective value, that there is such a thing as objective exploitation and it objectively is wrong? Or is my outrage against what I take to be exploitation merely a subjective preference that I have, or something that has been conditioned into me because I come from a certain group that has a certain value framework, and what's oppressive to me might not seem oppressive to you? When you enter into that territory, Foucault becomes much more postmodern. And what he does want to say explicitly is there is no way objectively to ground historical accounts. Historical accounts are, and this is why he comes up with new terms, archaeology, rather than doing history, because it's a matter of storytelling about past events, and he recognizes philosophically that he is constructing his own narrative, in according with his subjective values, and he hopes that those values that he has, when he recounts them, push the same kind of value buttons with him, but he does not have any philosophical resources to say that this is true, this is objective, and that these values are universal. In fact, he explicitly says they are not. It's a competing battleground of different power groups engaged in subjective and unequal power struggles.
I think that brings us back to where we started, perhaps. Would you say that it's possible to create, or do you believe in the possibility to create a human society exempt from irrationality, religion, belief systems, and social wars, where we believe that I have the truth and you don't, etc.?
Yeah.
A society of reason.
Yeah. Well, I think we have done great work over the course of the last 3 to 4 centuries in doing so. Science has made great progress. Technology has made great progress, and in terms of all of the materialistic measures, we are an extraordinarily progressive society. I also think in terms of moral measurements, basic human decency, religious tolerance, ethnic tolerance. I think despite all of the obsession among some intellectual quarters with racism and sexism and so forth, we have made great strides in becoming the least racist societies ever and the least sexist societies, and whatever your criteria are of freedom and equality, we've made great moral strides in doing so. We've gone from, with respect to religious intolerance, living in societies where amazing, right? Millions and millions of people living together, and people have the freedom to pursue religion or not pursue religion as they want. All of those are great moral achievements. Slavery as just a moral abomination. 4 centuries ago, nobody really had a problem with slavery. People didn't want to be slaves, but if they had, won the war and conquered, they would, of course, have made slaves of the other people as well. Right. The idea that there's something morally repugnant about slavery and that we should do something about that, that is a great achievement in the modern world, and it happened in a historical blink of an eye, just 1.5 centuries or so, until now the vast majority of people are abhorrent with respect to slavery and so on. So yes, I think we can do it. I think that we still are making progress. I do think that postmodernism represents a challenge, a very deep philosophical, well-articulated challenge to the aspirations of modernism and the Enlightenment. I think the battle has been joined. I don't think, though, that it ever is going to be automatic pilot, or that we will create ever a perfectly rational society. I think that partly it's because, bottom line is, we are individuals. We have our own brains, we have our own minds, and we're all in control of our own minds. And so each of us as individuals has to do the philosophical work of forming our belief system, forming our value system, working on our characters and our habits, and becoming smarter, more decent human beings. And some people will do that, and some people will not do that, and some people will do that better than others. So all that we can do is philosophically and culturally, institutionally, is set the ground rules within which people are able to do that, and encourage and incentivize people to do so. But I think in any generation there always are going to be some people who don't rise to the challenge. And also I think there are going to be some pathological individuals who will damage their children irreparably, to the point where the children cannot develop into fully rational, decent human beings as well. I think also intellectually the issues are complicated. And I think always there will be some people who are attracted to postmodernism, attracted to modernism, attracted to pre-modern faith systems as well in any generation. And so we will always have this ongoing debate. So I think it's going to be more a matter of, we will be slowly going up the cultural development curve, but there's no necessity to it. And I think we also have the capacity, because we do have free will, we can collapse back into barbarism.
No. But when you say we, do you mean we in the Western world, or we as a humanity? Or, because I think, there are differences.
Yeah, no, I think we as a humanity. I think Western world is starting to become more of a misnomer. as we are becoming more cosmopolitan and more global. I think Western is more of a historical label now, just in that what we take to be the core institutions philosophically, the commitment to reason and rationality, to individualism, the idea of universal rights and so on. It was Western nations that first developed those ideas, won the intellectual battles, instituted them culturally and so on. But they have been spreading around the world. And so I think it's becoming truly a kind of a human inheritance.
I think a lot of our viewers here would think that liberals have been a little bit naive in believing in the individual capacities, because we in Sweden we have had a lot of immigration from Mellanöstern, the Middle East, and people who come from Islamic countries. We are all individuals, but those individuals don't do the same individual choices that the individuals who are Swedes.
Right.
They tend to do other individual choices.
No,
so I mean, what I mean to say is culture counts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And if we are perhaps supposed to defend our Western values, as I believe they are Western, we have to perhaps defend something more than our individualism. We have to defend our culture on a collective level, because it's within the frame of that culture that we can develop our individualism.
No, I think you are exactly right that we'll use this, Western liberal individuals have been naive. And it's very easy to oversell how easy it is to develop the ideas and the cultural institutions of the West.
Oh yeah, we've seen that.
I think we would first then have to say that while we can be impressed with how far the West went in just a few centuries, it still did take centuries. And it might be too optimistic then to say that people from other cultures that do not have those ideas and institutions in place, that they can't just go from where they are to where we would like them to be in one generation even, or 10 years. Or they can just get fresh off the boat or fresh off the airplane and instantly be assimilated. So it does take each individual a lot of work to do so. And to some extent, we have an enormous head start if we are born into a culture where from day one, we are encouraged, we are taught explicitly, sometimes taught implicitly, and we are incentivized in hundreds of different ways to think and behave a certain way. All of that takes a great deal of work. And I think it's an open question how much individual psychology can adapt. Right, so I do want to say, if you were to take, you can't do this experiment, but if you were to take babies born anywhere in the world, raise that kid with a middle-class family in Sweden, that kid would grow up to be a Swede with Swedish ways of thinking and Swedish cultural values. If you had taken that same kid at age 8 and adopted him at age 13, at age 17, at age 28, the results are going to be different. And there's going to be some constants there with respect to human development. But the other factor is that each person still is an individual, and no matter how much people are incentivized and surrounded by the same culture or not, people we know can reject various aspects of a culture on purely individualistic grounds. So people born in the same family can grow up to have very different personalities, very different politics, very different religions, and so on. So the naivety point, yes, I agree with. And I do think that we have to think carefully about the cultural mixing and have realistic expectations for how long the assimilation is going to take place. At the same time, all of the cultural diversity. What are the core Enlightenment civilizational values that we are going to insist upon, and what kinds of things can be ethnic differences and religious differences and individual variations as well. All of that territory does need to be worked out.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, though, just to follow up on this point, on the Western point, so if you think about Japan, right, or you think about Botswana, right? Or you think about Argentina. You can go to Japan and you will find Western values there. You can go to Buenos Aires and find there's a whole upper middle class who are Western values. And the same thing with respect to Botswana. Now, these are 3 different continents. They're not Western in any original sense. And in a very quick period of time, they can recognize certain civilizational values for what they are, adopt them, and change their behavior. So I don't think there's anything unique about North America or about Britain or Sweden, racially, ethnically, geographically, that makes those the exclusive province of those places. They are the human birthright.
Yeah. Maybe we're just using language to... we're not thorough enough when we use language. We just say Western, but we should be...
Yeah, so sure. I think we're in a way at a similar place. If you read, if the history is interesting here. So if you think, prior to the Renaissance, Europeans would describe themselves as part of Christendom. And then the Renaissance comes along and early modernity, and you find people stop thinking of themselves as Christendom. They start thinking of themselves as European.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So I think we're doing a similar sort of thing right now, that the values started off as Enlightenment Western values, and so we would say Western philosophy, right? or Western identity, but now it's just becoming civilization, or it's just becoming the Enlightenment values.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We should find a word for it. Not globalization, or...
Well, I like the word globalization in many respects, but I understand it's also a dirty word. If by globalization you mean an elite cadre of individuals who are going to impose a certain political agenda on the globe, well, that's bad.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Very bad. Okay, Stephen Hicks, thank you so very much for coming here and for having this conversation.
A real pleasure.
And your book, Explaining Postmodernism, is a great book. I really learned a lot. And we didn't have time to talk about the resentment, so I compel all our readers to read the chapters about the resentment.
Okay.
Thank you so very much.
All right, a pleasure. Thanks.
And thank you for watching Riks.